The Forum of Velos had stood for 11,000 years. Its walls were made from the compressed dust of dead stars, dark and smooth and cold to the touch. Its floors had been walked on by so many species over so many centuries that they shone like mirrors. The ceiling was open to the sky, covered only by a thin field of energy that kept the air inside warm and the rain outside where it belonged. It was the most important building in the known galaxy, and everyone who entered it knew that. On the morning of the 31st day of the galactic cycle, the chamber was full. Delegates from 49 civilizations had taken their seats under the amber light of the central beacon. The Theran elders sat in their high curved chairs, their forearms moving slowly as they spoke among themselves. The Delvari delegates were still and silent as always, their flat black eyes catching the light. The Surin block sat together in a long arc of polished seats, their exoskeletons gleaming, their posture easy and confident. Every species that mattered in the known galaxy had sent someone to this room. And in the third row from the front, at a plain rectangular table with a small blue flag on its corner, sat the human delegation. Commander Diane Kowalski did not look like the kind of person who changed things. She was of average height, with short brown hair that had started going gray at the temples, and she had the sort of quiet face that made people either trust her immediately or feel that something important was being said without words. She wore a simple gray uniform, with no decoration on it, except her rank pins. She had been in galactic diplomacy for 19 years, and had learned early that the people who dressed the most impressively in rooms like this were usually the ones with the most to hide. Beside her sat Cole Baxter, her senior advisor, who was 31 years old, and had the look of someone who had not slept well in several days. He had a data pad in front of him, with too many open files, and dark circles under his eyes that told the story of the last 3 weeks clearly enough. On Diane's other side sat Nina Rourke, who was quieter than Cole and sharper, the kind of person who said little and noticed everything. The matter before the council today was the Surin proposal. It had been presented 28 days ago by the Surin delegate Preth, and on the surface it was a simple thing. A small planet called Deva Minor sat in the path of an expanding stellar event. The star at the edge of that system was unstable, and had been for some time, and in approximately 40 years it would produce a burst of radiation that would make the surface of Deva Minor uninhabitable for any carbon-based life. The Deva who lived on that planet were a pre-contact species. They knew nothing of the galaxy above them. They farmed. They built with stone and bronze. They told stories around fires at night. And they had no idea that their sky was slowly becoming a death sentence. The Surin were offering to move them. It sounded generous. It sounded like exactly the kind of thing a civilized galactic body should do. There were procedures for pre-contact intervention in cases of existential threat, and the Surin had followed every one of them, at least on paper. The proposal was long and detailed and full of language about humanitarian obligation and the sacred duty of advanced civilizations to protect those who could not yet protect themselves. Diane had read all of it. Cole had read all of it. Nina had read all of it 3 times. And on the 29th day, Cole had found the footnote. It was buried in the relocation annexes in a subsection that dealt with what the Surin called post-transfer integration protocols. The language was technical and dry, and clearly written to be skipped by anyone who was reading quickly. Cole had not been reading quickly. He had been reading the way he read everything, slowly and with a marker in his hand. And when he reached page 214, he had stopped and read the same paragraph 4 times before he was sure he understood what it said. He had printed it and put it in front of Diane without a word. She read it once. She read it twice. She set it down on the table, the way you set down something that is heavier than it looks. The Surin were not proposing to relocate the Deva to a free world. They were proposing to move them to a labor settlement on the Surin frontier, a place called Processing Station Vereth, where the Deva would work the mineral extraction fields. They would be housed and fed and kept alive. They would be protected from the stellar event, but they would never be told why they had been moved, or that a choice had been made for them, or that they had ever had the option of knowing the truth. Their children would work the same fields, and their children's children. It was not rescue. It was slavery with a cover story written by lawyers. Diane had spent the next 2 days trying every diplomatic channel available to her. She had requested a meeting with Preth and been told the delegate was unavailable. She had sent a formal inquiry to the council secretariat, asking for clarification on the annexes, and received a reply that used a great many words to say nothing at all. She had spoken to the Delvari delegate Kresh in the corridor outside the northern chamber, and shown them the paragraph, and Kresh had read it with those flat black eyes and then said very carefully that the proposal had been reviewed and approved for the floor. That had been yesterday. Now it was today, and the chamber was full, and the vote was 20 minutes away. Diane looked at the Surin block, in their long, confident arc of seats, and felt something settle in her chest that was not quite anger, and not quite grief. It was something older and quieter than both of those things. She had been in this kind of room before, in smaller forms, in human rooms back on Earth, where something wrong was dressed up in enough paperwork, and enough procedure, and enough polite language that everyone in the room could agree to let it happen and still feel clean afterward. She had never been able to do that. She had tried once or twice, early in her career, and it had not agreed with her. Cole leaned close and spoke in a low voice. "They have the votes. 31 confirmed." "I know," she said. "Even if we speak against it, it passes. I know that too." Nina was looking at the exits. She had been looking at them for the last several minutes with the careful attention of someone who is not looking at exits by accident. Diane picked up her datapad. She looked at the chamber one more time, at 11,000 years of civilization gathered under an amber light, at the carved symbol above the main entrance that was supposed to represent the unity of all thinking beings. Then she looked at Cole and Nina and said, simply and quietly, "We are going to leave." Cole looked at her. "Now?" "Right now, before the vote begins, all of us, every human in this building." Cole was quiet for a moment. He looked at the chamber around them, at the 49 flags, at the press cameras positioned in the upper galleries, at the ancient walls that had never once seen a delegation walk out. "They will be furious," he said. Diane was already standing up. "Yes," she said. Diane stood up from her chair, and the sound of it was very small in that large room. But Cole noticed. Nina noticed. And then, one by one, the other humans at the table noticed too. There were 15 of them in total, including the aides and junior staff seated in the observation gallery above. And they had all worked with Diane long enough to know that when she stood like that, with her shoulders straight, and her face calm, and her datapad tucked under her arm, something had been decided. She did not make a speech. She did not raise her hand to address the council. She simply walked away from the table, toward the nearest exit, and her footsteps were quiet on the ancient polished floor. Cole grabbed his pad and followed. Nina was already 2 steps ahead of him. Above them, in the observation gallery, Pete Garland, the youngest member of the delegation at 24 years old, looked down and saw what was happening. He had been a diplomatic aide for less than a year, and had spent most of this posting reading briefing documents and fetching coffee, and trying to understand how a room full of the most powerful beings in the galaxy could make decisions so slowly. He watched Diane walk toward the exit, and understood in an instant what it meant, and he stood up and gathered his things and went down the side stairs without being told. The other aides followed him. The Forum of Velos had 49 delegations seated in its chamber that morning. It had cameras from 63 galactic news networks positioned in the upper press gallery. It had security officers from 6 different species stationed at the 4 main entrances. It had a head of council, the Theron Elder Velos, who had been running sessions in this chamber for 30 years, and had seen arguments and protests and procedural fights of every kind imaginable. He had never seen a delegation walk out. The silence came in stages. First, the people closest to the human table noticed the empty seats and went quiet. Then the people near them noticed the quiet, and looked up from their own conversations. Then, the delegates in the far arc of the chamber turned to see what everyone else was looking at. And then, the silence was complete. And the only sound in the Forum of Velos was the soft footsteps of 15 humans crossing a floor that had stood for 11,000 years. Velos watched from his high chair at the head of the chamber. His forearms had gone completely still, which was unusual for a Theran. And the delegates nearest to him later said that his expression was not anger, not yet, but something more like the look a very old person gets when they see something they thought could not happen. The Surin delegate Preth rose from his seat. His exoskeleton caught the amber light and threw it back in small bright pieces as he turned to watch the humans go. He said nothing. Whatever he was thinking stayed behind his face. The humans reached the exit. Diane pushed the door open. The amber light of the chamber spilled out into the pale white corridor beyond. And then the door closed behind the last of them, and the human seats were empty. For a moment, nobody in the chamber moved. Then everyone moved at once. The noise that came up from the floor was not quite shouting and not quite outrage, but it was both of those things underneath. Delegates turned to each other and spoke fast in their own languages. The translation systems in the chamber, which were designed to handle simultaneous conversation from 49 species, struggled for the first time in recorded history to keep up. The Delvari block remained still and silent as always, but even they were watching the empty seats with their flat black eyes in a way that was different from how they usually watch things. Velos raised all 4 of his hands for order. It took longer than usual. In the corridor outside, Diane walked at the same pace she had walked inside. The rest of the delegation followed her through the grand atrium, past the wide windows that looked out onto the Velos station concourse, under the carved arch of joined hands that marked the main entrance to the forum. The arch had been there for 8,000 years. It depicted hands from a dozen species pressed together, a symbol of the cooperative will that the forum was supposed to represent. Diane did not look at it on her way out. Pete Garland caught up to her just past the arch, on the concourse proper, where the pale light of the Velos star was coming through the station's upper windows and laying long white lines across the floor. "Commander," he said, falling into step beside her, "the vote is going to pass without us." "Probably," she said. "Then what did we accomplish by leaving?" Diane stopped walking. She turned and looked back at the forum doors, which were large and dark and closed, and behind which 11,000 years of civilization was currently in uproar over 15 empty seats. "When something wrong happens in a room, and every person in the room agrees to let it happen," she said, "it becomes invisible. It becomes normal. It becomes tradition." She looked at Pete directly. "We just made it visible." Pete thought about that. He was young and he was tired and he had spent a year learning how diplomacy worked, and what he had learned was that it worked through presence, through staying in the room, through negotiating and compromising, and finding the language that everyone could agree on. Walking out of a room felt like the opposite of all of that. But he thought about the paragraph on page 214, which Diane had shown him 2 days ago, and he thought about the Deva on their small planet under their unstable star, farming and building and telling stories at night, with no idea what was being decided for them in a room they would never know existed. He did not say anything else. Nina had her communicator out and was scrolling through it as she walked. 47 press requests, she said, in the last 4 minutes. "Answer all of them," Diane said. "All 47? Every single one." Cole was looking back at the forum doors. "They'll call it a diplomatic tantrum," he said. "The Surin will spin this as humans throwing a fit because they couldn't win the vote." Diane said, "Let them. And then let every news network in the galaxy show their viewers what is on page 214 of the relocation annexes, and let people decide for themselves what to call it." Cole was quiet. He looked at the communicator Nina was holding, at the number on the screen that had now climbed past 60 press requests and was still going up. He thought about 60 news networks. He thought about the delegates inside who had voted for the proposal without reading the full annexes. He thought about the ones who had read them and voted for it anyway. He thought about what it meant that the humans were the only ones who had walked out. "This is going to be a very long few days," he said. Diane looked at him, and there was something in her face that was not quite a smile, but was close to one. "Yes," she said, "it is." Behind them, through the great closed doors of the forum, the vote had begun. The vote passed in 18 minutes. 31 in favor, 14 opposed, and 15 empty seats where the human delegation had been sitting. The result was announced by Velos in a voice that was flat and careful, the way a person speaks when they are controlling something larger underneath. The Surin bloc received the result with quiet satisfaction. The 14 who had voted against it sat with their flags and their pads, and the particular look of people who had lost a fair fight but suspected it had not been entirely fair. Outside in the human delegation quarters on the 32nd floor of the Velos station, Diane heard the result on the news feed and turned the screen off. She sat at the long table in the center of the room and looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked up at Cole and Nina and Pete and the rest of her team, who were spread around the room with their pads and their coffee and their tired faces. "All right," she said. "We work." Cole had already set up a second screen on the side table. Nina had a list of every press contact who had sent a request, organized by network reach and species audience. Pete was at the window with his pad, reading something with the focused look of a person who has found something important, and is making sure he has understood it correctly before he says anything about it. The next 18 hours were the kind of hours that did not feel long while they were happening, because there was no time to notice the length of them. Cole gave 7 interviews. Nina gave 9. Diane gave 4, because she chose her ones carefully, the largest networks with the widest reach, and she said the same thing in all 4 of them. She did not call the Surin criminals. She did not call the council corrupt, or broken, or complicit. She simply read aloud from Section 14, Subsection 9 of the relocation annexes, slowly and clearly, and then she said that the human delegation had left the forum because they did not believe it was right to sit in a room where a vote like that was being held as though it were a normal thing. Then she stopped talking and let the reporters ask their questions. It was the reporters who used words like slavery and deception. Diane had not used those words. She had not needed to. By the end of the first day, the footage had reached every major network in the galaxy. Not just the interviews, but the original footage from the forum cameras, the wide shot of 15 humans standing up from their table and walking quietly to the door, while the rest of the chamber watched. Someone had cut it to 30 seconds. Someone else had put it on the open feeds without commentary. Just the image and a line of text at the bottom that read, "The human delegation leaves the forum before the vote on Deva Minor." In 30 seconds of footage, you could see everything. You could see how calm they were. You could see the empty chairs. You could see Preth watching them go, with his exoskeleton catching the light. You could see Velos, with all 4 of his arms completely still. You could see, if you were paying attention, the exact moment the rest of the chamber understood what was happening. On the second day, the Delvari delegate Kresh requested a private meeting with Nina. Nina met him in a small conference room on the 28th floor, which had a window that looked out onto the docking rings and the distant stars beyond. Kresh arrived wearing the dark wrap and indicated personal discomfort in Delvari custom, and he stood near the window rather than sitting down, which also meant something in Delvari custom, though Nina was not entirely certain what. "My delegation was not fully briefed on the relocation annexes," Kresh said. Nina did not say anything immediately. She had learned over a long career that the space after a difficult admission is important, and that filling it too quickly is a mistake. "I understand," she said, after a moment. Kresh's flat black eyes moved to the window. Outside, a supply ship was making its slow way toward one of the outer docking rings, its running lights blinking in the dark. The Suren presented the proposal as a straightforward humanitarian measure. The annexes were described as administrative. They were not administrative, Nina said. No, Kresh agreed. They were not. The supply ship reached its dock, and the running lights went still. If there were to be a motion to revisit the proposal, Kresh said carefully, would the human delegation be willing to return to the chamber? Nina looked at him. She took her time with the answer. Not because she did not know it, but because she wanted the answer to mean something when she gave it. Yes, she said. We would come back. Kresh made a small movement with one hand that Nina recognized as acknowledgement. He stood at the window for another moment, looking out at the docks. Then he turned and left the room without further ceremony, which was also a Delvari custom, and which meant in this context that the conversation was concluded and the next step was understood. Nina sent a message to Diane as soon as the door closed. 3 words. Kresh is moving. On the 3rd day, 4 more delegations reached out through back channels. The language in all 4 messages was careful and diplomatic, and said nothing directly, but the meaning in all 4 was the same. They had read the annexes. They had questions. They wanted to know what the humans knew. Cole handled 2 of these conversations. Diane handled the other 2. They answered every question, and offered no pressure, and made no demands. They simply shared what was on page 214, and the pages around it, and let the other delegations draw their own conclusions. On the evening of the 3rd day, Pete was still at the window when Diane came to stand beside him. The Velos star had set behind the far edge of the station, and the sky outside was dark and full of other suns. Do you think Velos will call a special session? Pete asked. I think he has to, Diane said. The council's credibility depends on being seen to take this seriously now that it is out in the open. Velos has been running that chamber for 30 years. He knows what legitimacy looks like and what it doesn't. Below them, the station concourse was still busy with the movement of delegates and staff and the various beings who kept a place this size running. Life had gone on, in its ordinary way, even while the extraordinary thing played out above it. Do you think the Deva have any idea? He asked. Any sense at all that something is happening? Diane looked out at the dark beyond the windows, at the stars that were other suns, at the distance between here and a small planet where people were living by firelight. No, she said, they don't. That's strange to think about. Yes, she said, it is. On the morning of the 4th day, Velos sent a message to the human delegation. It was brief and formal, and said only that the Forum of Velos would convene a special session to review new evidence relating to the Surin proposal. All delegations were invited to attend. Cole read it twice and then looked at Diane across the table. She was already putting her datapad in her bag. Time to go back, she said. The human delegation arrived at the Forum early. Diane had made that decision deliberately. She wanted their seats filled before any other delegation arrived, wanted any camera that was pointed at the chamber to see the blue flag at the human table, and the people sitting behind it calmly, without drama, as though they had simply been there all along. She did not want their return to look like a victory lap. She wanted it to look like what it was, people coming back to finish a job they had started. The chamber filled slowly around them. Some delegations arrived in their usual groups and took their seats without acknowledging the humans. Others looked over as they came in, brief glances that meant different things depending on the species. The Surin block arrived last, and Preth walked to his seat with the long, smooth stride of someone who had already decided how this session was going to go. Velos opened the session with a short statement. He said that the council had received new information relating to the Surin proposal, and that it was the duty of the Forum to review all relevant evidence before considering any matter of this magnitude closed. He said it without looking at the human table, and without looking at the Surin table, which meant he was being careful not to assign blame to either one, at least not yet. Then he gave the floor to the first delegation. It was the Delvari. Kresh stood and spoke for 6 minutes. His voice was flat and precise in the way that Delvari voices always were, and he said clearly that his delegation had reviewed the relocation annexes in full and found that the nature of the proposal had not been accurately represented to the council at the time of the vote. He said the Delvari formally withdrew their support for the Surin proposal as it currently stood. He said this without any apparent emotion, which was not the same as not feeling any. When he sat down, there was a stillness in the chamber that was different from the silence when the humans had walked out. That silence had been shock. This one was something heavier. This was the sound of 31 votes starting to count themselves again. 3 more delegations spoke before the midday break. Each one said a version of the same thing Crescent said, in the careful language of beings who were correcting a mistake without calling it a mistake out loud. The Tharan junior delegates exchanged looks with each other. The press gallery above was at full capacity, and had been since the doors opened. Preth requested the floor during the afternoon session. Velas gave it to him. Preth stood, and for a moment he simply looked at the chamber. His exoskeleton was still catching the amber light in the same way it had the day the humans walked out, and he wore the same smooth expression he always wore. The expression of someone who had prepared for every possible version of this conversation. He said that the Surin took the concerns of their fellow delegates seriously. He said that the language of the relocation annexes had been technical in nature, and that the Surin acknowledged it could have been communicated more clearly to the full council. He said that the Surin remained committed to the welfare of the Deva, and wished to present a revised proposal for the consideration of the forum. He sat down. Cole leaned close to Diane, and said quietly, "They prepared a backup." "Of course they did," she said. The revised Surin proposal was distributed to all delegations within the hour. Nina had it open on her pad before most of the other delegations had even begun downloading it. And she was reading with the same focused attention she brought to everything, her stylus moving slowly down the screen as her eyes moved faster. Diane watched the chamber while Nina read. She watched Preth sitting in his seat with his easy confidence. She watched Velas, who was reading the revised proposal with 2 of his hands, while the other 2 rested on the arms of his chair. She watched the delegates around the room who were all doing the same thing, all reading the same document, all making the same quiet calculations. Pete was beside her. He had grown up a little in the last 4 days. She could see it in the way he sat, the way his eyes moved around the room. He was paying attention differently than he had at the start of this session. "What do you think they changed?" he asked. "Everything visible," she said. "Nothing they didn't have to." Nina looked up from her pad. "It's different," she said. "The annexes are rewritten. The labor provisions are gone. They're proposing a sanctuary relocation, an uninhabited Class M world on the Surin border. No work requirements, no contact restrictions. The Deva would be free to live as they choose." "Is that it?" Cole asked. "I've read to page 60, Nina said. "I need another hour for the rest." She read for 2 hours. Then she sent the document to the 2 xenolegal specialists she had been working with remotely since the first day, and they read it for another 3 hours, and then they sent back a report that was 7 pages long, and said, in careful, precise language, that the revised proposal appeared to be genuine. No hidden footnotes, no buried annexes, no language that meant one thing on the surface and another thing underneath. Diane read the report twice, then she read the revised proposal herself, not every page, but the ones that mattered. And then she set it down and looked out at the chamber, which had gone quiet in the late afternoon light, most of the delegates having returned to their own quarters for the recess. And she sat with the particular feeling of a person who is not yet certain, but is becoming so. That evening, Pete knocked on the door of the small office she had been using. She called for him to come in, and he stood in the doorway with his pad in his hand. "I found something," he said. "It might not be anything." "Tell me." "The sanctuary world they're proposing. I pulled the survey records." He came to the table and set his pad down so she could see the screen. "It's a real planet. Habitable, stable star, Good atmosphere. But 6 years ago, the Surin filed a preliminary resource claim on the subsurface mineral deposits. Diane looked at the screen. She looked at the date of the resource claim. She looked at the coordinates of the sanctuary world. They let it lapse, Pete said. 2 years ago. The claim is inactive. But it was filed. Yes. Diane looked at it for a long moment. It could mean nothing. Claims were filed and lapsed all the time for 100 different reasons. Or it could mean the Seren had considered this planet valuable once and had a reason for presenting it now as a gift. Put it in the file, she said. We raise it in session tomorrow as a question, not an accusation. We ask Preth directly about the resource history of the sanctuary world, and we let the chamber hear his answer. Pete nodded. He picked up his pad and started to go, and then stopped. Commander, he said, do you think the revised proposal is honest? Diane looked at the window, where the Velos star had nearly set, and the first faint stars of the outer systems were becoming visible in the dark. I think it might be, she said, and I think the only way to know is to keep asking the questions. Pete nodded again and left, and Diane sat alone in the small office, with the quiet and the darkening window, and the feeling of something that was not finished yet, but was moving, slowly and carefully, in the right direction. For the original vote. Delegates who had sent junior staff on the first day had come themselves this time. The press gallery was packed to its limit, and there were overflow feed points set up in 3 corridors outside the main chamber, because there was not enough room inside. Whatever the Galactic Council was about to decide, nobody wanted to miss it. Diane arrived at the human table and found a short written message sitting on her seat. It had no signature on it, only the Theron symbol for personal correspondence, which meant it had come from Velos directly. It said, I hope today ends better than it began. She folded it and put it in her pocket. The session opened with Pete's question about the resource claim. Velos gave Pete the floor, which surprised several people in the room, because Pete was the youngest and least senior member of the human delegation, and it was unusual for the head of council to recognize a junior aide. But Velos was a careful man, and he had clearly read the briefing that the human delegation had submitted the previous evening, and he understood that the question needed to be asked by someone who had found the information, not by someone who had been handed it. Pete stood up. He was nervous, which was visible in the slight stiffness of his shoulders, but his voice was clear and steady. He presented the resource claim simply and factually. He said the Surin had filed a preliminary survey claim on the proposed sanctuary world 6 years ago, that the claim had been allowed to lapse 2 years ago, and that the human delegation was raising this as a question of transparency, and asked that the Surin delegate address it for the record. The chamber was very quiet. Preth stood. He looked at Pete for a moment, with the expression of someone choosing their next words from a very short list. Then he said clearly and without apparent difficulty that the resource claim had been filed by a Surin commercial division that operated independently of the diplomatic corps. He said the claim had been lapsed because the mineral deposits were too deep for cost-effective extraction. He said the planet had been selected as a sanctuary candidate because it met the necessary biological and atmospheric criteria, not because of any commercial interest. He said all relevant documentation would be made available to the council. He sat down. Cole leaned close to Diane and said quietly, "Do you believe him?" "I believe the documents will check out," she said. "Whether I believe him is a different question." The full documentation arrived during the recess, and Nina spent the break reading it with the Xeno-legal team on the line. They found nothing inconsistent with Preth's statement. The commercial division was real. The extraction assessment was real. The lapse was real. It was possible it was exactly what he said it was. The session resumed. 3 delegations spoke in favor of the revised proposal. 2 spoke against it, citing the need for more time and more review. The Theron junior delegate spoke at length about the precedent being set, and the need for the council to establish clearer disclosure rules for proposal annexes in the future, which was not a vote for or against the Suren, but was a vote against ever being in this position again. and Diane thought it was probably the most important speech of the whole session because of that. Then it was the human delegation's turn. Diane had been thinking about what to say for 3 days. She had written several versions and discarded all of them because they were too long or too formal, or tried too hard to make a point that was already made. What she had ended up with was short, and she read it now from the single page in her hand. She said that the human delegation had returned to the forum because this was where the decision was being made, and they believed in being present for decisions that mattered. She said that the original Seren proposal had contained provisions that were unacceptable to the human delegation, and that the walkout had not been a rejection of the forum, but a refusal to treat an unacceptable thing as though it were normal. She said that the revised proposal appeared to address those provisions, and that the human delegation was prepared to vote in favor of it, provided the full documentation remained available for public review, and the council established an independent monitoring process to ensure that Deva relocation proceeded as described. She put the page down and sat. The monitoring condition had not been in any previous discussion. She had added it the night before, quietly, without announcing it, and she watched Preth's face as the translation reached him. His expression did not change, but one of his secondary arms moved slightly, a small involuntary motion that she had learned, over many years of watching Seren delegates, indicated discomfort. Velas noted the condition and asked Preth to respond. Preth said the Seren would accept independent monitoring in principle, subject to the scope being defined by the council. Velas said the scope would be defined as full, which meant the monitoring body would have access to all aspects of the relocation process. He said it without preamble and without asking whether that was agreeable, which was the most direct Diane had seen Velas be in any session she had attended. The vote took place in the late afternoon. 37 in favor, 9 opposed, 3 abstentions. The revised Seren proposal was approved. The chamber did not erupt this time. The reaction was quieter, more considered, the sound of a room that had been through something and come out the other side with a different understanding of what it was doing. Even the press gallery above was subdued in its response. After the session closed, Velas walked across the chamber floor to the human table. He did this slowly and without hurry, and the delegates around him watched without appearing to watch, because everyone knew this was not a casual walk. He stopped at the edge of the human table and looked at Diane. "You caused significant disruption to this body," he said. "I know," she said. "I am sorry for the disruption. I am not sorry for the reason." Velas looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Cole and Nina and Pete, and his forearms were very still. "The monitoring body will need a human representative," he said. "It is a 2-year posting." Diane looked at Pete, who was standing at the end of the table, trying to look like he was not paying close attention, and clearly failing. "I know someone who might be interested," she said. He opened his mouth, and then closed it again, and then looked at Velas, with the expression of someone who is trying to be professional, and finding it very difficult. Velas inclined his great silver head. "The posting requires someone with attention to detail, and a tolerance for long documents," he said, with a deliberateness that made Diane think he had been told exactly how the footnote had been found. "He has both," she said. Velas nodded once and walked back toward the head of the chamber. Cole started packing his bag. Nina was already on her communicator. Pete stood at the table for a moment longer, looking at the chamber around him, at the flags and the carved walls and the amber light of the beacon that had been burning for 11,000 years. 2 years, he said, mostly to himself. "It's important work," Diane said. He nodded slowly. Below him, somewhere at an uncountable distance, a small planet was turning under its unstable star, full of people who were living their lives without knowing that this room existed or that anything had been decided for them here. They were building and farming and telling their stories, and they did not know, and they would not know for a long time, maybe ever. but the decision that had been made for them was a better one now than it had been a week ago. Pete picked up his bag. "Yeah," he said, "it is." They walked out of the forum together, through the grand atrium, and under the arch of joint hands, into the pale white light of the concourse. The Velo star was low on the horizon, and the station was full of the ordinary sounds of a place returning to its ordinary business, after something extraordinary had passed through it. Nobody stopped them on the way out. Nobody said anything at all. They had done what they came to do.